artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hi, this is episode 279. We are delving into the perennially thorny issue of AI and homework today. And here I would just like to point out that this introduction was not written by AI, and delve just happens to have always been one of the words that I like, and has now turned into an occupational hazard of being mistaken for an AI. Not a risk I had on my bingo card 5 years ago. But today I will be talking with Alyson King, professor in political science at Ontario Tech University in Canada, and editor of the new book Artificial Intelligence, Pedagogy and Academic Integrity, containing 12 contributors' thoughts and research on the problem of maintaining academic integrity in a world where AI can complete virtually any school assignment at a passing grade or higher. This is an information-dense academic textbook aimed at researchers and educational leaders. Alyson earned her PhD in the history of education at the University of Toronto, and currently she engages in research intended to better understand student experiences and academic integrity. In her teaching, she includes topics related to Indigenous experiences and worldviews, such as residential schools, and has designed a course about the politics of Indigenous rights. We're going to talk about plagiarism, AI-proofing assignments, motivating students, threats to critical thinking, and a lady from Paris. I know you teachers and parents and students out there are keenly focused on this issue, so let's get into the interview. Alyson King, thank you for joining us on AI and You, and you're joining us from Ontario to talk about a book that you've recently edited, academic work of research titled Artificial Intelligence, Pedagogy and Academic Integrity. That is such a loaded topic right now. There are thousands of educators, and I've talked to many of them personally, probably tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of educators around the world right now, from high school to university and in all kinds of other places, in great confusion and anxiety at the moment around the topic of academic integrity. Let's ease into this and tell us how you got into the position of editing this book and what difference you're trying to make with this.
So I'm part of a large research project on preventing plagiarism, and we've been gathering a lot of data from students about what they do in their writing and research process, what they think about those activities. We've been doing surveys, interviews, and then most recently a writing task where we recorded how they do their research and writing, doing a videotape. So we haven't had a chance to look at that data yet, but been looking very closely at the survey data and the interview data. It's a big team of researchers, and there was a smaller subset of us that were very interested in looking at how generative AI was going to impact the way students do their research and writing, their academic tasks. And so we decided that we would get together and put together these chapters for this book. I think I volunteered to be the editor, so putting it all together, organizing it, putting together the call for papers and all of that stuff. Yeah, so that's sort of how I got into it.
And what sort of reception have you had?
People seem to be really interested in it. I think we came up with a really good sort of sampling of different approaches to generative AI and how it relates to academic integrity. Obviously, because the technology is changing rapidly, every time I open up the news on my phone or a physical paper or whatever, there's something new about generative AI or artificial intelligence. So I think of it as a snapshot of a moment in time and what we have found and what we're thinking about in terms of academic integrity and teaching and generative AI.
Well, and as you say there, things are changing so fast. It is a challenge to find the way in which you can make a difference that doesn't become dated. And to ground that in some examples, there are chapters in the book that talk about some of the mistakes of AI, like when it was asked for a pizza recipe to get the toppings to stick and it suggested adding glue. And that hasn't happened in a long time. Those examples there don't seem to be with us any longer. I'm not saying that there aren't still mistakes, of course, but they appear to be harder to locate. In fact, one example that was appealing to me was that in Patrick Girola's chapter, he asked it to write a limerick about a lady from Paris, and Perplexity came up with this. There once was a lady from Paris whose fashion was never to spare-is, with a beret so chic and a scarf round her neck, she strolled down the Champs-Élysées. There's lots of problems with that. It barely scans and doesn't rhyme. So I decided to stick that into ChatGPT, and it came up with this. There once was a lady from Paris whose charm was both subtle and airy. She'd stroll down the Seine in sunshine or rain and leave every poet quite merry. And I have no problems with that. And of course, when I first read that, I started out, there once was a lady from Paris whose charm was both subtle and airy. And I go, well, that doesn't work. And then I realized what it was doing, or at least what I thought it was doing. So I asked it about the pronunciation. And it said, yep, there's two ways of pronouncing Paris. And this is the one that I picked. And it kind of, I think it undermined the thesis that the large language models have little understanding of the higher order aspects of language, which is where that chapter was going, because as much as you can characterize these models as simply being word sequence generators, if you ask a question and get an answer that you think requires understanding to generate it, then the way it got there may not be that important. How do you feel that this impacts, that was a very lengthy lead in here, this question, about how do you feel that analysis of the abilities of large language models impacts the way that they're used in education right now, either formally or behind the scenes?
Yeah. So, I mean, that chapter was intended to try and give a little snapshot of how these language models tend to work, right? Obviously, things are going to be changing constantly. But I thought at the time, I thought that article or that chapter allowed for a newbie, somebody that's not tech-oriented, that's not a computer scientist, it allowed for a clear explanation of how these algorithms and things work, how these tools are generating language. As I said before, we went into this knowing that things were changing rapidly. So the author of that particular chapter is someone who is a computer scientist. So I think it's, if you take it in terms of more the big picture, I saw it as a way for people who weren't tech-oriented to be able to understand how some of these tools are working and where the pitfalls might be. Now, obviously, as things get better and better and better in terms of Gen AI, those errors, as you say, will not be happening.
Right. And yet they are still there. But what it seems is happening is that they're getting a lot harder to describe and to encapsulate. I'm very interested in this project about preventing plagiarism. And plagiarism comes in for some precise definitions in this book. So can you give us this expansive definition of plagiarism that you operate from?
So, well, that's an interesting question. Nobody's ever asked me that question before. I mean, I think the way we're approaching plagiarism in the book is from an educative perspective. So plagiarism generally is about taking someone else's words, and using them without crediting it. So with that as a basic definition, we need to be aware that all research comes from knowledge from other people. So how do we put things together so that how we teach students to honor the research that they've done and where the ideas have come from, as well as the words, and teach them how to recognize that in their writing.
As one of the universities there, cited in another chapter in the book, says, putting ChatGPT's words in and passing them off as your own is plagiarism because you're plagiarizing ChatGPT. And that seems to make perfect sense. But plagiarism, we might be used to this narrow sense of you're copying someone else's words. But then with ChatGPT, there are ways of getting words in that are not only not traceable to any particular individual human, but that you can work with them in ways that you're not necessarily even plagiarizing ChatGPT at that point. They've been changed, but you have circumvented the learning process that was intended to take place. Do you lump that under the heading of plagiarism?
That's an interesting question too. I mean, technically it would be, and I think I tend to approach it more from the idea of what are you learning when you do something like that, right? So if you're using the words of ChatGPT, arguably ChatGPT is plagiarizing someone else, right? That's what some people have argued. But you take the words from ChatGPT and use it as your own, well, it's not really your own because you haven't done the thinking behind it. I know some of the journals are now, as you mentioned, about all the different policies and rules around whether or not you can use ChatGPT. The argument that ChatGPT cannot defend what it's written, does that mean that can you defend what they've written if you are using it? I don't know. I mean,
you certainly need to be able to. I'm going to quote a teacher cited in another chapter as part of a study who said, quote, "I realized right away that I was going to have to change things because some of my teaching practices left the door wide open for the use of ChatGPT, and on a metaphysical level, I refused to waste my limited time spent on this earth marking things done by a machine in 6 seconds. That's a no. In fact, I've systematically modified my exams and assignments so that it's impossible to do them all with ChatGPT." End quote. I think most educators on the planet right now could resonate with that and would then say, how have you made it impossible to do these assignments with ChatGPT? What avenues do you see for educators being able to AI-proof their assignments?
Yeah, I think it's pretty darn hard to AI-proof your assignments, but it is something that I've been thinking about. So some folks will have defaulted to doing everything in person. That's one way. I like the idea of scaffolding assignments. So having students do their assignments in stages where you get them to submit proposals and your annotated bibliography. That's sort of one of my default ones. But then also talk about it in class, and then also do maybe some peer review where they each talk together about their research. And I believe that you need to engage the students, as one of my colleagues says, engage their hearts and minds so that they can take pride in their writing. And that's one strategy for encouraging students not to plagiarize, right? Or not to cognitively offload their thinking to generative AI. Not everybody will approach it in the same way because some people say, well, you should be using AI. Teach them to use AI so that it builds their critical thinking skills and you delve into it, the responses from the Gen AI, so that you're not just plopping in a prompt and then using the results as your assessment. So other folks that I've heard about will allow that students to use Gen AI, but they have to indicate where they used it and how they used it and ask questions about how they use it. So some folks will, again, use that sort of scaffolded process where they take the responses and ask the students questions about it and get them to fact check and all kinds of things. Like there's all different models where people are trying to find new ways to either prevent the use or embed the use or something different, right? Something more thoughtful, and it encourages critical thinking. I don't think there's one single answer to this, for sure. And I think it's going to get increasingly hard to prevent the usage of these tools because it's going to be increasingly embedded within all the software that we're using, right? Copilot and Microsoft and things like that. That's one that's already there when you use Microsoft Edge or whatever, right? It's just right there.
It was good to see a general agreement that AI detectors are not the way to go. I've been thinking that all along. And I'm wondering to what extent you view this as a new problem. One chapter goes to some length to point out that plagiarism and cheating have been around forever, that you could always get your big sister to do your homework for you. And yet everything else seems to argue that this is new, that something fundamental has changed. What do you think?
I think it's something more about how do we convince students that their thinking, their learning, the effort they put into something is worthwhile, that they will benefit from it in the long run. We already know that some of the entry-level jobs that students would often start their careers in are now being done by generative AI. But then you also see reports that the graduates who are better able to navigate and come up with better prompts and so on are the ones that are getting good jobs or decent jobs. Even though they have to use that, still they're making sure that it's effectively used, I guess would be the word.
Well, I've spoken about this before too, but one of the problems I see in education at the moment reacting to this is conflating AI literacy with the subject being taught. So they're not discriminating between how do you get better at using AI and how do you get better at the subject that you're supposed to be here for, which might be physics or nothing to do with AI. And also, what the workplace wants is not what the school wants. The workplace does not care if the employee learns. It wants a result. The only thing that counts in the school is learning, even if you're learning something that other people have already learned. That's kind of the point of school. And so I'm wondering, do you have an opinion on whether academic integrity at this point is a bigger problem in post-secondary or high school?
I suspect, I don't have evidence for it, but I suspect it's a bigger problem in the lower, like in secondary school and high school. But I don't know. I mean, maybe it's equally bad because students come in knowing how to get around some of these tech tools. They start learning how to use the tools in high school, and then they get to university, and if things are harder than they expect, they might default to using the same tools they were using before. I mean, my experience has been that students come out of high school with a huge range in not just ability, but knowledge about how to engage in academic work. Sometimes it's as basic as having a high school teacher who taught their students this was my experience with my daughter, was teaching them APA, supposedly, but I looked at it and it was like all wrong, But at the same time, some students come out of high school with really awesome skills and knowledge.
APA as in the writing style? APA?
APA citation style is what I was thinking. Yeah.
Right. The book mentions the perception that generative AI robs students of the motivation to write and think for themselves. And that is certainly something that we must discover the extent of. How can educators restore that motivation?
That's a good question. I think some educators are better than others at motivating students. I don't think I have a magic answer for that one, but it is something that I think all educators need to be aware that student motivation to do well and to engage in what they're learning is key for their future success, I believe. So finding ways to try and motivate them is challenging, especially when you get to the university level, when you've got some lecturers who lecture in the old school way versus, and when I may say old school, I think of talking at students rather than engaging in discussion and looking at assessments that are authentic to the students and their lives, right? So that kind of thing. I mentioned that in the chapter that I wrote, that I co-wrote with one of my colleagues, that students are more engaged if they're writing about something they care about. So if you can find ways to provide opportunities or choice in your assessments, maybe that's one way to engage students and get them motivated.
And students don't know everything that they care about. At any given time, any human being hasn't explored all of the range of things that they might care about. It's a continual process. So teachers have the opportunity to help the students discover what they care about. That seems like something that is definitely outside of the range of what AI can be used for right now. Do you think there's an opportunity here? Can you see how teachers might be able to leverage this moment to do more of that personal inspiration, the Dead Poets Society or Stand and Deliver, dated movies, I know, but to create that motivation?
Certainly, I do think there's some instructors that really seek ways to do that. One of my colleagues, Sharon Loricella, she talks a lot about ungrading and putting fun into education. So she says some really interesting strategies like taking students out to the forest for a listening class where they stayed out for a week camping. But obviously not everybody could do that, right? So it's finding ways to make what you're teaching fun for the students so that they are looking for it. But fun sounds very superficial, right? And how do you do it in large classes versus small classes? So there's all kinds of, you need a variety of strategies depending on what you're teaching and the context in which you're teaching. So are you teaching a first year class with over 100 students or 200 students versus one with 40 or 50 students, right? Your strategies have to be very different. Can you do peer review activities, which is one way to engage students, right? Getting them to read each other's papers and provide comments. Can you do that in large classes as well as small classes? Done it, and it works quite well. Students actually find that that is one way that engages them. They find it useful to talk to each other. And there is this sort of dialogic process to critical thinking, right? So the more you talk about what you're learning, the more likely you are to remember it and to think more critically about it and possibly more creatively about it. And if you do some of these things, then perhaps your students are less likely to default to Gen AI or to cheat on their essays and so on. I think the more engaging the classes are, the better. Of course, that's hard too, right?
But I think that word engaging is more useful than fun. Lots of movies are engaging, but not all of them are fun, but don't have to be. You can be engaged by a tragedy. Let's look at a hypothetical example here. Suppose we were to discover that use of generative AI impaired learning. I know some studies are already asserting that, but it's certainly going to come down to details of how it's done. And that many places where students are using it are harmful. How would you approach convincing students of that so that they didn't do that, even if it's going to get them the easy grade?
Well, my default is usually to provide the evidence, show them how, what the research is showing about that. When I first heard about Gen AI, my first thought was, does that mean I never have to read a Brad essay again? Right? But then, as an aficionado of catastrophe movies, the apocalyptic movies, if you start thinking about what would happen if students relied solely on using Gen AI for generations, what does that mean for our capacity, you think?
Is it Idiocracy or Wall-E? Thinking about catastrophe movies.
Yeah. Or the other one is I can't remember the name of the movie where they're sitting in all the cars and then they can't walk when they get out of the cars because all they do is sit in outer space.
That's Wall-E, isn't it?
That visual always comes to mind.
Right.
If you don't use it, you lose it. So we know that about physical health, but I imagine we're going to find that it's the same for our brain health, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're not engaging in critical thinking, if you're not reading, if you're not out in nature and so on, it changes the way your brain is working, is what the evidence seems to be showing, not just about Gen AI, but about other things as well. So I think looking at the evidence is very useful. But I also think that Gen AI tools are not going to be going away. So I think it's really important for us to be thinking about how to use these tools in ways that encourage thinking as opposed to just doing the work for us. Maybe, I think I read somewhere, maybe the Gen AI tools do the tedious work and we get to do more creative stuff. But of course, as a political scientist, this is something that what happens when the jobs are all being done by computers or Gen AI? How do we survive? So you come to the argument about we needing basic annual incomes and all of that kind of things, which lots of people are saying we need currently, because if you look at the amount of homelessness across Canada and around the world, and a lot of it is because people have lost jobs, right? So, as well as other issues. But
income inequality, and one of those things that we rely on or hope that the generation in school now is going to solve in the future. So their education becomes a critical matter. So how they use AI in this is going to be something that we have to get a handle on, and pretty fast. And that's the end of the first half of the interview. We split these up so you have more accessible chunks that are more likely to fit into your commute. Next half, next week. In today's news ripped from the headlines about AI, OpenAI just released a new study showing that AI models can now perform real work tasks almost as well as industry experts. The tool they released to do that is called GDP-Val, and it's evolving the way that AI is evaluated, from tools like the MMLU, or Massive Multitask Language Understanding Exam-Style Test, or the ominously named Humanity's Last Exam, to more real-world tasks drawn directly from the real-world knowledge work of experienced professionals across a wide range of occupations and sectors. Interestingly, that also describes how current thinking of student assessment is evolving. GDP-Val spans 44 occupations selected from the top 9 industries contributing to US GDP. Maybe that's why it's called GDP-Val. Every task is based on real work products, such as a legal brief, an engineering blueprint, a customer support conversation, or a nursing care plan. So this is squarely taking aim at the utility of AI in the workplace. Maybe a reaction to studies like the MIT one that said most businesses hadn't realized any benefit from AI yet. Next week, we'll conclude the interview with Alyson King when we'll talk about teachers getting to know their students' voices, AI detectors, and the place of AI in education. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, It's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.